My name is Maud Harrington, and the first thing my father ever taught me was how to disappear inside a laugh that wasn't mine. He called me his lazy, heavy girl, loud enough for the whole world to hear, and the crowd always chuckled. Never with me, always at me. I learned early that humiliation doesn't just sting in the moment, it drills itself into your bones, waiting years for the day it can finally break free. The ballroom shimmered with crystal light, every chandelier casting sharp reflections across rows of polished glassware. Laughter and clinking silverware floated above the hum of polite conversation, the kind of practiced warmth that fills a room when people are determined to perform happiness. I sat quietly among them, my hands folded in my lap, trying to disappear into the folds of my navy dress. It was simple, deliberate, a shield against the extravagance swirling all around me. Mark stood at the head table with Jennifer, glowing in lace and certainty, the picture of youth at its most hopeful. My son's smile carried both nerves and pride, and I felt the familiar tug of relief in my chest. He had made it here, to this day, despite all the weight I once carried alone. The Hastings family moved through the crowd with the ease of people born to wealth, their laughter crisp, their eyes flicking like invisible scales that measured everything: shoes, accents, gestures. I felt their judgment like a draft at the back of my neck, subtle but cold. Still, none of that stung as much as the awareness of him, my father's presence, though he had arrived late, rolled over the room like a shadow slipping under the door. His cologne reached me before his voice did, sharp aftershave and the smoke of old menthols. When I turned, there he was, pushing through the crowd with that familiar swagger, suit fabric shining too bright, tie a chaos of patterns no one else would dare to wear. The smile on his face wasn't joy, it was possession. He wore it like armor, as if the evening belonged to him. I felt my pulse thud in my throat as he edged toward the microphone. No one had called on him, no one had asked for a word, but that never stopped him. He lived for moments like these, when all eyes turned his way, when he could tilt the spotlight in his favor. No matter who had to burn under its heat, his hand tapped the glass, drawing silence. A silence I knew too well, the quiet before he carved me open with words dressed as jokes. And as the room stilled, I knew something was coming. The same blade that had cut me all my life was about to strike again, only this time in front of hundreds. My chest tightened, not from surprise, but from recognition. This wasn't new. It was the oldest story I carried, and now it was about to be performed under chandeliers for an audience that would laugh just to belong. The smell of exhaust and wet gravel still lives somewhere in my memory. I am 8 again, standing in the church parking lot with Sunday shoes pinching my toes, when his hand clamps around my upper arm. "We're cutting back on donuts," he announces loudly enough for every deacon and usher to hear. Their laughter bursts out like gunfire, quick and mean, and I drop my eyes to the pavement. That was always the ritual, his words, the crowd's laughter, my silence. It didn't stop there. At the grocery store, at the potluck, even at the dinner table, he kept a stockpile of jokes ready to turn me into the punchline. My mother tried to patch the damage the only way she knew how. An extra spoon of meat stew, a second helping of bread, small offerings that never quite covered the sting. My brothers got words like sharp and quick, tossed to them like candy. I got comparisons to weight, clumsiness, laziness. I learned early to shrink myself, to stack parts neatly in his repair shop, sweep sawdust without being asked, disappear into usefulness so he would have nothing left to mock. But the ridicule bled out of our house and into the world. Teachers smirked at stories he told at parent nights. Classmates repeated his nicknames behind my back. I became the family's traveling anecdote, the girl in someone else's joke, and no one ever paused to ask how it felt. By 19, I had stopped waiting for anyone to defend me. I signed the enlistment papers during a lunch break and hid the carbon copies inside my math book. When I told him, he barked a laugh around a mouthful of food. "You won't last the first shouting," he said, waving me off. But the shouting saved me. The cadence of a drill sergeant's orders drowned out his voice in my head, and discipline became a language I could finally understand. Stubbornness turned into stamina, silence into command. On a mountain road in Afghanistan, when comms went dead, I climbed from vehicle to vehicle, rallying a convoy that could have been lost. One of those men later sent a picture of his daughter riding a bike, alive because I had done my job. I never told that story at home. Promotions came quietly. Captain, major, then full colonel, yet each trip back to Ohio, I zipped myself into soft cardigans, left my ribbons in a locked wooden box, and let him believe whatever version of me suited his story. He told relatives I shuffled papers in some office, failed at everything worth mentioning, even at Mark's wedding. I catch the flicker of pity in the Hastings' eyes, the polite dismissal reserved for women who seem small. And still I keep my silence, knowing that in his hands even my victories would be twisted into another punchline. The dinner hour had reached its peak. Music swelled from the bandstand, glasses lifted in polished hands, and the Hastings family's laughter floated through the air like it had been rehearsed. I sat still, folded into the corner of a table surrounded by their friends, men in tailored suits, women in silk and diamonds, doing my best impression of invisibility. It was safer that way, to fade into the linen and crystal rather than invite inspection. Then, as if on cue, he rose. My father, not listed in the program, not asked to speak, but claiming the room as though it had been built for him. He gripped the microphone with a confidence that wasn't earned but assumed, and the conversations tapered off one by one. He began harmless enough. Thank yous, a quip about country club food, but soon his voice shifted into the cadence I knew too well. He launched into a funny story. Me at 12, supposedly devouring 3 hot dogs at a fundraiser while everyone laughed. Polite chuckles spread like ripples across water, filling the room with a sound that scratched the skin. The truth, of course, was different. My brother had eaten 2 of those, but accuracy was never the point. The point was always the laugh, always me at the center of the ridicule. He leaned into the microphone, smirking, and delivered the cut he'd been sharpening all evening. This is my daughter, lazy, heavy, never amounted to much. The laughter that followed wasn't joy. It was obligation, 500 voices rising together, shallow and cruel, stabbing through me like pins. I sat frozen, heart hammering, aware that the joke was never just a joke. It was a verdict, and the ballroom was his courtroom. Heat flushed up my neck, a dizzy wave that made the edges of the room blur. My instinct screamed at me to flee, to vanish into the shadows like I had all my life. But then movement stirred at the edge of the head table. A group of groomsmen, friends of my son, shifted in unison. I blinked, recognition flooding me. Their faces weren't just familiar. They were mine. Afghanistan. Men who had once stood under my command, who had followed me through dust and fire. They had been there all along, quiet, watching. One of them met my eyes, then another. Their silent question hung heavy in the space between us. Is it time? My chest tightened, but I gave the smallest nod. Permission, alignment, whatever they needed to know, they saw it in that gesture. They set their glasses down, chairs scraped. 4 men rose to their full height, tuxedos pressed, but bearing the stillness of soldiers. And then, in one voice, "Sir, she's our commanding officer." The words cut through the hall sharper than any shout. The laughter snapped off. The silence that followed was thick, electric, as though the air itself had divided into before and after. My father's face drained. He lifted his wine, maybe to buy a moment, maybe to hide. But the sip betrayed him. He choked, sputtered, Bordeaux spraying across the white cloth in a stain that bloomed like blood. Gasps scattered through the room. Hastings' faces turned pale. Guests froze mid-motion. And then came the final blow. One of the men, Miller, spoke again, calm but iron in his tone. "With respect, sir, we'd prefer you speak of her accordingly. She saved lives. She led us when it mattered." I didn't move. I didn't have to. For the first time, the truth had stood up on its own legs, and it carried more weight than all of his jokes combined. The declaration from the groomsman still hung in the air, sharp and final, when the ballroom fell into a silence so heavy you could hear the chandeliers hum. My father broke it with a strained chuckle, forcing his lips into a smile that showed more teeth than warmth. "Come on, folks. Don't get tense. Just a joke. Can't anybody here take a joke?" His voice tried for charm, but it wavered, and the hollowness clattered through the microphone. A few scattered laughs fluttered and died almost instantly. Then Miller straightened, shoulders squared, voice low but carrying like a drumbeat. "Respect is not optional, sir." The words drew every gaze, snapped every head in his direction. It was no longer banter. It was a warning. Jennifer's eyes locked on me, the practiced coolness in her face cracking, giving way to something else, astonishment, and something that looked very much like awe. The Hastings, who had worn their superiority like a second skin, shifted uncomfortably, their certainty unraveling as realization took root. The woman they had dismissed had commanded men in war. For the first time, my father's swagger faltered. His hand shook as he grabbed another glass, wine trembling against the rim. The weight of the room was no longer his to command. And in that moment, he looked smaller than I had ever seen him, cornered in the very spotlight he had stolen. I walked forward slowly, the hush of the crowd parting around me. My fingers adjusted the microphone until its faint feedback quieted, and I stood steady, letting the silence ripen. Every pair of eyes was fixed on me, waiting, holding its breath. I spoke without anger, my voice even. "This day isn't about me. It's about two young people choosing each other. Marriage is the art of honor in close quarters. You don't have to be perfect to be honorable. You just have to tell the truth, especially when it would be easier not to." I lifted my glass toward Mark and Jennifer. The stillness cracked wide open with applause that rose like thunder, genuine and unforced. Chairs scraped back as the guests stood. Hundreds of glasses lifted in unison. They weren't saluting my father's humor. They weren't rewarding cruelty. They were standing for truth, for dignity, for something that couldn't be laughed away. I let my gaze sweep the room and pass over him without pause. Mercy refuses to audition. He sat rigid, his face pale, lips pressed tight, suddenly mute. The man who had ruled every room with a cutting word was now a shadow in the corner, invisible in the very hall he had tried to own. When the ballroom finally emptied, the echo of applause still clung to the walls, though hushed now, as if people feared breaking the spell of what they'd witnessed. Guests left in clusters of whispers, glances cast back at me with a mixture of surprise and respect. My phone buzzed with messages, thank yous, congratulations, quiet notes of solidarity, but one silence was louder than all the words. My father was gone. I expected it. Retreat was his habit, slipping into arrogance whenever truth cornered him. But this time, I refused to let the story end in his absence. 2 days later, I walked into the old repair shop in Ohio. The air smelled of oil and rust, of copper pipe and damp cardboard. A country station played low on a battered radio, static threading through the twang of a steel guitar. He sat hunched at the workbench, a pencil clutched in his fist like a weapon, eyes fixed on a ledger that seemed to hold him hostage. I didn't wait for him to look up. "Jokes are supposed to make the listener laugh," I said, my voice steady, "not humiliate them." He flinched, barely, then scowled. "You're too sensitive. It was just a joke." The words sounded smaller here, stripped of the crowd he usually relied on to echo them back. I stood straighter, meeting his eyes. "If you don't stop, I won't bring Mark here again. I won't let my son grow up inside the same circle of ridicule I did." The shop seemed to still. His jaw worked, but no sound came. He saw it then, my resolve, sharper than any punchline. For the first time, I wasn't asking for his approval. I was drawing a line, and he knew I wasn't bluffing. The shop was so quiet, I could hear the ceiling fan stutter with every turn. He stared at the ledger for a long time, the pencil frozen in his grip, until finally he set it down with exaggerated care. as if even that small act might break something fragile. His voice came low, roughened by years of smoke and pride. "All my life I mocked you because I was afraid," he said. "Afraid you'd outgrow me. Afraid you'd prove I was nothing without my cheap jokes." I waited for the anger to rise in me, but it didn't. What came instead was a steadiness I hadn't known I possessed when I was a child in his shadow. "You don't need to tear me down to stand tall," I said, each word deliberate. "But you do need to stop using me as your entertainment." His eyes flickered, then dropped. There was no apology, no grand gesture, only a curt nod, his jaw tightening like a man swallowing stones. It was clumsy, incomplete, but I recognized it for what it was, a surrender of sorts. In the days that followed, his change came not in speeches, but in small, awkward acts. One afternoon, he appeared at my door with a grocery bag. Inside lay a heap of tomatoes cushioned on a paper towel, the kind of offering that would stain a counter if not handled carefully. He cleared his throat and asked, "You got any salt?" It was the closest thing to contrition I had ever heard from him, disguised in produce and understatement. Another morning, he showed up at the Veterans Memorial, where a new plaque was being dedicated. I stood in uniform, the air filled with the solemn rhythm of folded flags and measured words. He didn't try to explain me away or soften the respect that came my direction. He simply stood beside me, silent, while strangers called me "ma'am" and shook my hand. For once, he didn't interrupt, didn't shrink me down to fit the version of me he was comfortable with. That silence was heavier than any insult he'd ever thrown, but it carried weight of a different kind. It wasn't dismissal, it was restraint, maybe even respect. For the first time, I felt his quiet not as an absence, but as a choice. It was messy, imperfect, and late. But sometimes change doesn't arrive as an apology wrapped in neat words. Sometimes it shows up as tomatoes in a paper sack, or as a man who doesn't reach for the microphone when the world is watching. And though I would never say it out loud, I understood, for him, this was the language of remorse, a language clumsy and halting, but at last pointed in the right direction. Weeks passed, and summer stretched long and warm. At a family cookout, the smell of charcoal clung to the air, smoke curling lazily above the grill, while voices mingled in casual conversation. Children darted across the lawn, unbothered by the heaviness adults carried. I stood near the picnic tables, watching from the edge, as I had done my whole life, waiting, bracing, expecting the familiar sting. My father moved slowly through the yard, balancing a plate piled high with chicken wings. The chatter dipped as he reached the circle of relatives and neighbors. I felt my stomach tighten, that instinctive dread coiling again. This was the stage he always claimed, the moment he twisted gatherings into spotlights for his sharp humor at my expense. My breath caught, prepared for the old script to return. But something shifted. He set the plate down on the table, cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice wavered between strength and something far more human. "This is my daughter, Maud," he said, steady enough for everyone to hear. "She's led and cared for more people than I ever have. That's all I'll say." For a beat, the yard went quiet. Then came nods, murmurs of agreement, the weight of recognition rippling through the group. No punchline followed, no cruel smirk, just words that stood alone, plain and unadorned, but finally free of ridicule. I let the breath I'd been holding slip out slowly. I didn't need him to say he was proud. I only needed him to stop cutting me down, to release me from the role of family joke. In that moment, I realized revenge was never about humiliating him in return. The truest revenge was stripping away the only weapon he had ever used, his cruelty. And so, I smiled, not at his approval, but at the dignity I had reclaimed. Late as it was, his fragile respect still shifted the ground beneath us. It didn't erase the past, but it redrew the future.